I'm sewing the inside liner that has been pressed into that accordion shape. It was folded in half here so that we can see where the halfway mark is. I'm lining up that halfway mark with this one toe of the presser foot. I've already stitched that one side, so now I'm coming up the other side. I'm coming from the bottom of the liner upwards so that the presser foot doesn't bump into these and want to flip them back as I'm sewing down. So I've already done my back stitch. Now I'm just going to run that seam, trying to be nice and straight. Every time you top stitch, it's good to go slow so that you're careful and accurate. I do not need to back stitch at this point because this seam is going to be tucked in to the rest of the wallet. The next stage of sewing the liner is taking the piece that was pressed and top stitched that had the accordion fold and placing it right sides together with one of the liner pieces. We're then pinning it flush on the one edge, on the top edge, so that my pressed edges are facing up. This will be the top of the wallet because my cards are going to slip down into these pockets. So I know I'm going to want to sew this top edge. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and my stitch width or my seam allowance will be set up at just beyond that outside edge of the presser foot. As we sew along, it's important to remember that when you get to a pin, you really need to stop, remove the pin, place it over into a pin cushion, okay, right, well, gee, here it is, and then continue sewing. If you leave your pins laying around, they could fall off the counter and you could end up stepping on them, which is pretty painful. You can see that my seam allowance is the outside edge of the presser foot here. All my seam allowances on this wallet project are running flush with that presser foot edge. So take that other pin out. Using the pin cushion, I'm going to come back to the edge of my project, make sure everything is still laying out flush, sewing to the end. And then, of course, I'm going to be sure to back stitch at the end of my seam. I lift my presser foot and I can cut my stitch. Now that these two liner pieces have been stitched together, we're going to pull them back and press them. After you sew a seam, it's a very good idea to press that seam open so that they aren't bubbling or showing loose and puffed. If you want everything to be nice and well aligned, it's really a great idea to make sure that you carefully press. Once I've folded that, you can see that this one seam allowance edge has been pressed up to one side. Now I can fold it over and line these out to be flush with this edge and press this top edge, okay, and then I'm going to top stitch it down. Now the two liner pieces are placed inside that sewing machine ready to be top stitched. You can see that I've carefully pressed the edge so that the stitched seam is right along that outside folded over edge. I've got it lined up in the presser foot as close to that edge. The edge of the fabric is actually inside where the presser foot is, and the needle I'm going to adjust to move it as far to this outer edge of the presser foot as I can. That's a neat little trick for careful top stitching. I've got different gauges over here. I can come over to the needle selector and push on my needle edge, and it's moving my needle to that far right. Now I can do a careful top stitch, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's done. And this is the top stitch of the liner. You can see that the needle placement is well off to that right side. I'm going to be careful that I don't get my liner too far to the inside of the presser foot, or it will disappear. Okay, I am not going to back stitch at this seam because it's a top stitch and it will also be buried inside the finishing. So I'll just stitch right off the edge, lift the presser foot, pull, and cut my threads. Now that that outer liner piece is finished, it's been stitched to an inside liner piece, so they both look nice and finished. I can lay this piece on top of that third liner piece that we had to cut. So I'm going to lay that out carefully, and I'm going to line it up so that the bottom edges are flush and that the top edge of the bottom piece, that's that little polka dot one, is poking out, because this is going to be an opening where the cash goes in. So it's really important you have that extra seam allowance on that back lining piece on the top end of these two liner bits. Then what I'm going to do to attach these is run a basting stitch along the edges. On the sewing machine, I'm going to show you what that looks like. The two liner pieces are prepped and ready to be basted together. I've got pins in the center of the two liner pieces so that they're not going to bump into the presser foot. They don't need to be removed until after I'm done sewing. I need to be mindful as my hand sits on there that I don't place it right on top of the point of that pin and poke myself, however. I need to adjust my stitch length so that it's running at a baste. Usually my stitch length is just over 2 millimeters. That's how far it runs for every stitch. If I want a longer stitch length, I can hit that button and push it all the way up to 5. That means 5 millimeters per stitch distance. And if I wanted to take that out afterwards, because let's say my baste went too far in this direction, and when I sew it to my good copy or my outer wallet piece, I don't want those basting stitches showing, so it's easy to rip them out later with a seam ripper. I'm also going to be careful that as I sew, I'm on the inside of that presser foot, because my seam allowance on the outer, when I go to sew this to the outer wallet piece, I don't want these stitches showing, so I want them on the inside of where that final seam allowance is going to be. So let me get this started and then I'll finish by showing you what it looks like. I've run the basting seam down to the corner and I'm turning this corner. I wanted to stop and make sure on video that you could see what the pivot looks like. I've placed the needle by hand down into the fabric and I've lifted the presser foot and I spin. That's my pivot. Now I can drop my presser foot and continue stitching. You'll see how much faster and farther the stitches move for every stitch. It's quite fast. So I'm careful to lay everything out and make sure that it's all flat, that nothing is puckering, that everything is flush. Again, as I come to this corner, I'm going to stop, turn the hand wheel towards me, drop the needle, lift the presser foot, spin, drop the presser foot again, and I can finish the baste off that last side. I never do a back stitch with a basting stitch, because a basting stitch is always done with the assumption that you're going to want to pull that out after, so no back stitch. At this point there will be a lot of little threads sticking out along the way. It's a good idea to just take a moment and trim those threads down. The next thing I'm doing is I've placed my liner to my outer wallet piece that has the interfacing fused to it. I'm sewing these right sides together. That means that the piece that has the card pockets is going to be touching the outside wallet piece, and I'm going to run pins all the ways around the edges. I'm going to stitch this so that I start on the top, I go all the ways around, and I finish at the top, but I'm going to leave a little opening here so that I can turn this whole thing right side out when I'm done.